It's quite something when you think about it. Modern Hong Kong, this uh, towering, vibrant place, starting out as a really quite quiet, almost overlooked island.
Hmm.
Even the name Fragrant Harbor, Shangang, sort of whispers about the past, doesn't it? A bit of a puzzle.
It really is. Was it the camphor wood, that sweet smell?
And maybe
Like,
something, well, less romantic, like very ripe seafood, perhaps.
exactly. That ambiguity right from the start, it's quite telling, I think. It hints at how the city's identity has been shaped by these sorts of dualities and unexpected shifts.
Precisely. And for you, our listener, you've shared sources digging into Hong Kong's history, and that's exactly what we're going to unpack today.
We're aiming to chart that improbable evolution.
Highlighting those key moments, the interplay of cultures, of power. We want to distill the essential stuff, give you a clear sense of how Hong Kong became, well, Hong Kong.
And to guide us, we're drawing quite a bit from A Brief History of Hong Kong by Associate Professor Dr. Afisavad Chayapalfada Siravaganawara.
Right. The author's goal there is to shed light on the present situation by looking back at the past. So our mission for this deep dive, get the crucial information, connect those surprising details, and ultimately answer that big question. How did this place become what it is today?
Let's dive in.
Okay, so early 1800s, Hong Kong. Pretty insignificant, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Population around 7,000 maybe, mostly on what was just described as a mountainous island. Not much going on, relatively speaking.
But then things changed.
Rapidly.
Very rapidly. The
Yeah.
catalyst, British opium trade. Coming from India, heading into China.
Suddenly, Hong Kong's location became strategically vital for this, well, let's face it, illegal trade.
Right. And the Qing dynasty naturally wasn't happy. They tried to clamp down hard in 1839.
These efforts to stamp out the opium trade, they directly led to a pretty forceful British response, didn't they?
They did. We're talking blockades,
Yeah.
naval bombardments, a real show of military force.
Which culminated in 1841 with the British actually occupying Hong Kong Island. And then formalized a year later, 1842, with the Treaty of Nanking. The island was ceded to Britain.
Now, here's something really important to grasp, I think. Unlike a lot of other colonies that had obvious resources, sugar, timber, gold,
Hong Kong had, well, basically none of that. It wasn't naturally rich in that way.
it had to be built, literally from the ground up. And interestingly, the main sea routes back then, the big east-west ones,
They mostly bypassed that part of the South China Sea. Many people at the time thought it was pretty unlikely Hong Kong would ever compete with places like Singapore or Shanghai.
that really underscores the point, doesn't it? Its success wasn't inevitable, not based on natural gifts.
No, it was constructed, driven by geopolitics, by strategy, and frankly by a remarkable adaptability. This forced opening, though terrible for China in many ways.
Paradoxically set the stage for Hong Kong as a free port, a complete contrast to the King's protectionist approach.
Absolutely. Now, before the British arrived, Hong Kong did have a history, of course, though records are a bit thin.
We know it gets a mention back in the Southern Song dynasty, in a text called
The Lingnan Datuiji, yes. And after 1276, it became part of the Yuan dynasty.
But still, our source says it was pretty obscure, sparsely populated, until the Europeans showed up.
Even Ming records just call it a narrow gap of water in Taiping Shan. Not exactly a glowing description.
And that name again, Fragrant Harbor, Shangang. We mentioned the ambiguity. Camphor.
Or, yes, the less appealing smell of rancid fish. The source makes a point of highlighting that uncertainty.
It's a small detail, but it kind of speaks to the humble beginnings.
And there were links with Taiwan in the Ming era. Apparently before the Ming, Hong Kong and nearby islands were largely uninhabited.
And life before the colony. It wasn't exactly a paradise. We're talking piracy, pollution, poverty, disease.
Pretty grim conditions. And the indentured laborers passing through faced appalling situations.
So the British weren't taking over a thriving metropolis.
Not at all. They got a strategically useful spot, but one that was seriously underdeveloped. Changes the perspective on its later growth, doesn't it?
It really does. Okay, let's zero in on that opium catalyst and how Britain actually got control. We know the general interest was trade, tea, silk, access to China.
And that trade imbalance was key. Britain was buying huge amounts of tea.
But the Chinese didn't want much British stuff in return.
Exactly. Which is where opium filled the gap, so to speak, initially brought in by Islamic traders.
Then massively cultivated by the British East India Company, specifically to fund their tea habit, bizarrely enough.
And the scale was just enormous. Between 1821 and 1840, the trade volume more than doubled. Value soared from like $1.8 million to $12 million.
Wow. So understandably, King officials hit back. Stricter measures, culminating in Linzexu confiscating that huge haul of British opium in March 1839.
1,900 tons, that was the flashpoint, triggered the first Opium War that September.
And British military superiority, especially naval, was decisive.
Yes, and Hong Kong itself felt the impact. HMS Proserpine bombarded the island in June 41.
Then the official occupation in January 41, followed by the Treaty of Nanking, August 42, ceding Hong Kong Island for the benefit of commerce.
That phrase, for the benefit of commerce, steeped in the irony of the opium trade.
And even after annexation, the opium kept flowing into Canton and Macau.
The British aims were clear, though. Establish stability, a free market on their terms, and demand compliance from Peking.
But interestingly, the initial thinking wasn't necessarily major trading port, more like a naval base.
Exactly, a strategic foothold. Access to the West River, potential for future expansion.
Which explains why Kowloon followed suit so quickly. It was part of that larger strategic picture.
Precisely.
So Hong Kong is British, but it wasn't an instant, well-oiled machine, right?
Yeah.
The early colonial period, up to maybe 1856, described as pretty ungoverned. Lawless, even.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment based on the source. Military orders held sway more than any real civil administration initially. It took time to build structures.
We see judicial courts declared in 1844, a municipal commission in 47.
And then a more formalized colonial government finally in 1855.
And once that framework started solidifying, things picked up economically.
Yes, from the 1850s onwards, commerce and trade really began to flourish. And you see more deliberate urban planning.
Like that first proper plan for Victoria in 1858, policies for piers and wharves later in the 1860s.
But, and this is crucial, alongside that development came deeply discriminatory policies.
Right. The Chinese Exclusion Ordinance of 1886 stands out.
But it wasn't alone. There was that English test for government jobs, discrimination in land and housing.
Police raids on bachelor houses, even racially biased public housing after WWII, initially excluding Chinese residents.
It's a real duality. You have this foresight and efficiency in some aspects of urban management and maintaining order, pre-war at least.
But overlaid with these really quite stark discriminatory practices, creating major social divisions.
Absolutely. And meanwhile, the physical colony kept expanding. Kowloon added in 1860 after the Second Opium War.
And the new territories leased in 1898.
And with the Opium Wars settled and foreign concessions popping up in China, Hong Kong really cemented itself as the regional commercial hub, the main center for trade and services.
Okay, let's jump forward. World War II, a massive turning point. And the source suggests a startling lack of British preparedness for the Japanese invasion in December 41.
It does seem that way, almost a kind of indifference or maybe denial. Bombardment hit on December 8th.
The evacuation order for officials came way too late.
And seemingly a degree of apathy among the local Chinese population towards defending the colony. It's complex.
A very different picture than you might imagine. Japanese forces landed December 11th, and things fell apart fast.
By Christmas Day 41, the governor was gone. Government control essentially ceased.
And the Japanese aims were clear.
Strengthen their sea and air power, deter Britain and the U.S. strategic goals.
But the reality on the ground, 3 years and 8 months of brutal occupation. The source is blunt. Killings, rape, beatings, looting, forced repatriation.
It's just horrific. Widespread destruction of infrastructure, civilian life shattered. The population dropped dramatically. Huge loss of life.
And disturbing to read that post-war, there was an effort to kind of suppress anti-Japanese feeling, to avoid upsetting relations with Britain.
Yes, that's mentioned. A political calculation, it seems.
And the cultural loss, too. Books, art, heritage, just gone, destroyed or damaged beyond repair.
A truly dark period.
So emerging from that darkness, Hong Kong needed to rebuild. And the post-war era brought another huge economic shift, didn't it?
It really did. While the colonial government had kept some functions going during the occupation and planned for reconstruction.
The game changer was the communist takeover in mainland China in 1949.
Right. That effectively killed Hong Kong's role as a major re-export hub for China trade.
But paradoxically, it sparked something new.
Industrialization. Hong Kong had to pivot. start manufacturing goods itself, mostly for the local Chinese market initially, using imported materials and capital.
And that's when we see the rise of those classic Hong Kong industries: wigs, toys, transistor radios.
Textiles, plastic flowers, watches, electronics later on, all that stuff.
Making Hong Kong this unique entity, a Western-aligned pocket of capitalism right next door to communist China.
A fascinating dynamic. British companies were dominant in manufacturing capital at first, but that shifted over time.
Though British interests stayed strong in utilities, power, gas, rail, the port.
But this rapid growth spurt brought its own problems, didn't it? Social issues started bubbling up.
Housing, education, healthcare becoming major concerns.
Especially housing. Rents soaring, property prices climbing, a feeling that public housing just wasn't keeping up.
We even have that poignant story from the doctor in the 90s, seeing the inequalities linked to mainland integration, housing, education firsthand.
Yeah, that really brings it home. These aren't just abstract economic trends. They affect real lives, create real anxieties.
And who was pulling the strings in colonial Hong Kong? The source points to the big business and finance tycoons.
The ruling elites, while citizenship and political rights were tied mostly to residency.
Decolonization, in this context, is framed partly as a strategic retreat by the national ruling powers.
But things weren't totally static politically. In the later colonial years, you see civil society starting to emerge, NGOs finding their voice.
And crucially, you had an independent judiciary, freedoms of press, assembly. This allowed for a kind of public political self-education.
Which maybe helps explain the anxieties leading up to 1997, the worry about mainland influence potentially eroding those institutions.
So the return to China. One country, two systems. A completely unprecedented arrangement.
Yes. British rule had offered some freedoms, but also came with that colonial discrimination and, unspoken controls.
And the one country, two systems principle itself.
Yeah.
Essentially guaranteeing Hong Kong's capitalist system and way of life would remain unchanged for 50 years, right? Giving it a high degree of autonomy.
That was the promise, enshrined in the Basic Law. But Hong Kong society was already transforming rapidly, becoming arguably harder to govern under the old colonial model.
Demands for political reform were growing louder, met with a mix of pushback and gradual, often limited, concessions.
And the source suggests the Hong Kong government really underestimated the socio-political turbulence that would follow the handover.
Which became very visible with that huge protest on July 1st, 2003.
A real turning point. Post-handover politics became this complex arena: nationalism versus liberalism, socialism versus free markets, authoritarianism versus democracy, all these tensions playing out.
So how did one country, two systems actually function in practice? Hong Kong consistently ranked highly for market competitiveness.
Yes, on those metrics, it performed well. But perhaps other areas saw less focus, like infrastructure planning, airports, railways despite population growth, and health concerns like SARS.
And then big policies like the individual travel scheme from 2003. Huge impact from mainland tourism.
The source makes an interesting contrast with Beijing on congestion management, suggesting Hong Kong had more sustainable policies there. Changes to the MTR's business model, too.
And the perennial issue: sky-high land and property prices. Partly a legacy of Western governance styles, and maybe insufficient affordable housing historically.
That's the argument presented. And ultimately, the early success of the system relied heavily on the credibility and skill of the chief executive.
Okay, let's track the political developments through the phases outlined. First, colonial shaping, 1842 to 82.
Characterized by some ambiguity in those early treaties, like the 1842 Convention of Peking. Status wasn't crystal clear initially.
Compounded later by the PRC's view that British rule was illegitimate.
And it became an international issue, too. Some countries were okay with British administration. Others worried it hindered China's unification.
Then the negotiation phase, 83 to 97, decolonization. Not just about Chinese nationalism, right?
No, it was a complex negotiation driven by China's national priorities and Britain's significant economic stakes in Hong Kong.
And the common law system, rule of law, became really important checks and balances during that transition.
Which leads to the third phase, 1997 onwards. Return to Chinese sovereignty and subsequent legitimacy crises.
Which connects to the more recent protests. Post-2014, a definite uptick in activism.
Yes, often linked to perceived mainland influence, education, media, politics.
And frustration over the slow pace of democratic reform seems to be a core driver.
Absolutely. How these protests play out was also shaped by media and the political climate.
That rapid increase in protests from 2012, it signals a real shift. But the roots go deeper,
Much deeper long-term processes are at play.
like the 2014 umbrella movement. Student-led, protesting restricted democratization plans.
Right. The occupation of districts, the umbrella becoming this powerful symbol.
Protection against authoritarianism, as it was framed.
The source calls it a loss of innocence for Hong Kong youth pursuing democracy. It lasted 79 days. Mixed results in terms of immediate political goals.
But it broadened the demands, didn't it? And perhaps fueled that rise in localism, anti-mainland sentiment.
Arguably, yes, it had complex consequences.
Then, 2019, the anti-extradition bill protests sustained large-scale opposition.
Triggered by that specific murder case in Taiwan, exposing legal loopholes.
But the real fear was extradition to the mainland legal system, which was explicitly forbidden under existing law.
Exactly. It tapped into deeper anxieties about communist influence, about defending Hong Kong's distinct system. The scale and duration were remarkable.
And concerns about extradition changes had been raised before the bill was even introduced, right? By lawyers, business groups?
Yes, and the feeling that public consultation was rushed just added fuel to the fire, leading to those broader 5 demands.
These protests also speak to anxieties about cultural identity, this idea of localism.
It's presented as a way to protect Hong Kong's sociocultural heritage against perceived mainland encroachment.
You see this growing divide in identity, in values, concerns about mainland tourists' impact, about perceived interference in governance.
Like the oath-taking controversy with legislators, changes to the election committee. These events heighten tensions over rights guaranteed by the basic law.
Even sports became politicized sometimes.
Reflecting tensions, though sometimes perhaps mitigating them. Governments often see sport as a tool for national identity, social cohesion.
And language and education are so central to culture. Hong Kong's mixed Cantonese mother tongue, complex characters, historical English use.
A unique linguistic landscape. Post-97, English kept official status, Chinese became co-official, and education reforms after the handover really highlighted its role in shaping culture and language.
It's interesting to look back at the British rationale for the bilingual education policy, too.
Strategic motivations there, for sure.
And the art scene reflects this spirit, too. The distinct Hong Kong literary voice emerged in the 70s.
Often using Cantonese, connecting directly with local readers, a way of asserting identity.
Despite political sensitivities causing some self-censorship, the source calls the art scene a willful child. Unruly but vibrant.
Yeah, I like that description. Performing arts, especially theater, have really thrived.
Metis arts, that fusion of influences, it captures something essential. And theater often acts as a witness to history, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Enduring reminders of identity.
Economically, Hong Kong is just full of contrasts. Big city, small territory, dense population, lots of parks, metropolis, yet gateway to China, Chinese city, Western influences.
Ruled under one country, 2 systems. High autonomy, its post-handover economic story has been closely watched. Would it buck the trend of some other former colonies?
And largely it has, hasn't it? Sustained GDP growth, remaining vibrant despite its size and lack of resources.
Its location, international organizations, legal system, institutions, huge advantages, making it a key global business center.
Hub for air and sea routes, preferred spot for regional HQs, massive container port, crucial facilitator of China trade.
Plus, consistently ranked as one of the freest economies. Low taxes, no tariffs, light regulation, very attractive for investment.
And strong institutions like the stock exchange and the monetary authority add stability.
Looking back, that transformation from fishing villages to economic powerhouse, driven by British ambition initially, then later by influxes of capital and entrepreneurial energy.
The Opium Wars, destructive as they were, fundamentally reshaped its trajectory, propelling it towards being a key trading post.
Internationally, Hong Kong's always been seen as ambitious, effective, strong on commerce, investing heavily in transport infrastructure, a major aviation hub, despite not being a sovereign power.
And its global role is multifaceted. Key access point to Asian markets, preferred location for HQs, benefiting from that government hands-off approach to business.
And despite the diplomatic complexities, there's this potential role, a bridge between China and the West.
A middleman, maybe, helping understanding, perhaps even diffusing tensions.
It's a possibility, given its unique status, but maintaining its own social and economic success is key to having that international influence.
Which leads to the future. Under Chinese sovereignty, still a subject of debate, concern for some foreign businesses.
Though the source notes that for many investors, stability is the #1 priority.
That East-West cultural interplay continues to define it. Predictions vary full integration with China eventually.
Perhaps, but it retains advantages, like in IT. And the government commitment to minimal interference in business seems to remain, largely.
Politically, tracing the path from colony via Opium War to now. It's been shaped by the weakening British position, the trauma of Japanese occupation, rising Chinese nationalism within Hong Kong.
Right, and expectations shifting post-WWII, hopes for independence, the changing diplomatic scene.
Then the handover itself. Concerns shifting from British control to potential Beijing influence. That growing gap between the public and government leading up to '97. A search for a post-colonial identity.
And economically, that continuity in government structures post-handover was vital for stability, retaining officials, processes.
Plus, China's own economic boom obviously benefited Hong Kong hugely, acting as a secure zone, expanding financial services.
But new challenges emerge too, like those environmental concerns, air, water pollution, and how the government responds. That's part of the sustainability picture now.
So wrapping this up for you, our listeners, some key takeaways. Hong Kong's story is just extraordinary, from quiet island to global crossroads.
A narrative of trade, conflict, cultural fusion, political evolution.
The impact of the Opium Wars, the complexities of British rule, the trauma of WWII, that unique one country, two systems experiment, all shaped its distinct identity.
And that initial improbability still stands out, doesn't it? How did this place, without obvious resources off the main trade routes initially, become so significant?
It really challenges assumptions, and its journey offers broader lessons, I think, about colonial legacies, political transitions, the power of cultural identity.
And one country, two systems remains this fascinating ongoing case study in navigating different political and economic models with all its inherent tensions.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you.
Yeah.
Considering this intricate past and the current dynamics with mainland China, what single factor do you think will be most decisive for Hong Kong's future?
And what aspects of its unique, resilient heritage do you think will prove most enduring as it continues to navigate these transformations? Something to mull over.